What if I told you that something very serious, it happens every time Mass is celebrated, but almost no one notices? It's not an exaggeration. It's not a metaphor. It's a real warning left by saints who saw what ordinary eyes cannot see. Padre Pio said that if people truly understood what happens at the altar, no one would be left standing. Everyone would fall to their knees, some from fear, others from love. Most people enter the church as they would enter any other place. They sit, stand, answer, automatically look at their watch. But according to Padre Pio, at that very moment, the heavens silently open, angels approach. Something invisible to our eyes happens right there, in front of us. And it was precisely at that instant, during Mass, that Saint Teresa experienced one of the most terrifying events of her life. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't imagining. She was awake, praying, looking at the altar. And then she saw something that made her heart race. It wasn't a beautiful sight in the usual sense. It was powerful. It was heavy. It was impossible to ignore. Something that made her understand that the Eucharist is not just a symbol, nor a religious custom. It is something alive, real, present. Many years later, Padre Pio confirmed this same warning with even more direct words. He said that the greatest problem of humanity is not the lack of faith. It is the lack of awareness. People attend Mass without realizing they are witnessing the greatest mystery that exists. And this, according to him, hurts more than any visible sin. This is not a warning to frighten you. It is a call to awaken. Because after hearing what Saint Teresa saw and what Padre Pio revealed, no one can look at Mass in the same way anymore. Before understanding the terrifying vision, it is necessary to understand who was Saint Teresa, because that changes everything. She wasn't just some ordinary person telling a strange story. Saint Teresa of Avila was a studious, intelligent, practical, and very observant woman. So much so that the Church itself declared her so, Doctor of the Church, a very rare title, given only to people whose teachings help Christians of all ages. She didn't believe in any sensation or emotion. On the contrary, Saint Teresa had fear of being wrong. Whenever she experienced something unusual, she would take everything to confessors, theologians, and spiritual directors. Many times, she even asked God to stop those experiences because she didn't want to be deceived or deceive anyone. This already shows something important. She wasn't seeking visions, they simply happened. Saint Teresa lived in a difficult time, full of conflicts inside and outside the Church. Even so, her life was simple: prayer, work, silence, and discipline. Nothing excessive, nothing fantastical, and precisely for that reason, when she described something supernatural, people stopped to listen, because they knew it didn't come from imagination, but from a deep and well-examined faith. What makes your experience even more powerful is that the place where it all happened, it wasn't at home, it wasn't in a dream, it was during Mass, at the most sacred moment. For Saint Teresa, it was so real that it marked her entire life. After that, she never again saw the Eucharist as something ordinary, and that's why her story matters even today. Because if a balanced, prudent woman examined by the Church was so deeply shaken by what she saw, perhaps the problem isn't with her. Perhaps it's in how accustomed we've become to something that should never be treated as routine. It all happened at a moment that for most people goes almost unnoticed. The Mass was proceeding normally, the prayers were familiar, the altar was there, simple, silent. Nothing extraordinary seemed to be happening, and it was precisely then that something extraordinary happened. Saint Teresa was attentive, in prayer, with her heart turned towards God. She was not distracted. She was not expecting anything different. And then, at the moment of the Eucharist, his perception changed completely. It wasn't like seeing a new object. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes for a few seconds. She kept seeing the same altar, the same priest, the same setting. But at the same time, she saw something beyond, Something that made no noise, drew no attention, caused no confusion. It was silent, and for that very reason, frightening. Saint Teresa realized that this moment was not symbolic. It was not merely a religious gesture repeated for centuries. It was something alive, happening right there, in that exact second. The most impressive thing is that she didn't lose consciousness. She didn't fall. She didn't enter a visible state of ecstasy. Outwardly, everything seemed normal. Inside, her heart was pounding, as if she were facing something too big to be explained in simple words. She understood at that moment that what happens at Mass doesn't depend on what we feel. It depends on what, and even if no one notices, even if no one is moved, something profound happens. This detail changes everything, because if the presence is real even when no one notices, then it is not our attention that creates the sacred. It is the sacred that is there, waiting for someone to awaken. When Saint Teresa looked at the altar at that moment, she didn't see something beautiful in the usual sense. It wasn't a gentle or tranquil image. What she perceived was strong. It was too intense to ignore. It was as if the whole truth of the Eucharist was there, laid bare before her, unfiltered. She understood that she was not facing a symbol, nor a distant memory. What was happening at the altar was real. Christ was there in a living, present way, giving himself again, not as something repeated out of habit, but as an act of love that continues to happen. This made her tremble inside. Saint Teresa perceived Christ's suffering united with immense love. It was not empty pain, it was sacrifice for love, and this completely changed the way she viewed that moment of the Mass. The altar, which to many seemed like just a simple table, became for her the most serious and sacred place on earth. She understood something that is both frightening and comforting at the same time. Christ gives himself even when no one notices, even when no one pays attention, even when people's hearts are far away. This does not diminish his presence. On the contrary, it shows the magnitude of his love. This understanding was difficult for Saint Teresa, because upon seeing this, she also understood the responsibility of being there. It was no longer possible to participate in Mass in just any way. It was no longer possible to view the Eucharist as something commonplace. What she saw at the altar wasn't just a vision, it was a shock of reality, a silent reminder that, in that small space, something greater happens than any words can explain. What most affected Saint Teresa in that experience was not the vision of Christ or the sacrifice she witnessed. What made her real tremor, that's what she saw in the people around her. She noticed something that we often don't see either. The people were there at Mass, physically present, but their hearts and minds were far apart. Some were conversing silently, others simply weren't paying attention to what was happening at the altar. For many, it was just a ritual to be fulfilled. Nothing more than a custom, a tradition, a part of the weekly routine. They didn't see what she saw. They didn't feel what she felt. And worse, many didn't even seem to care. Saint Teresa was deeply saddened to realize this. She knew that the presence of Christ in the Eucharist did not depend on our perception. He's there anyway. But she also knew that by not paying attention, by not noticing what was happening, people were missing the chance to connect with something much bigger, something that could transform their lives. But that was being ignored. She was especially touched to see how the indifference regarding the Mass, it hurt Christ more than any obvious sin. He was there, giving himself up, and many weren't even looking at him. Imagine what it's like for someone to offer you something from the heart, and you don't even notice. This was the crucial point for Saint Teresa. True participation in Mass is not about being physically present. It's about being present in heart and mind. She saw that by not paying due attention, by not surrendering to the moment, people were missing the chance to experience a daily miracle. And that, for her, was the most frightening vision of all. What Saint Teresa experienced was not confined to the past. Decades later, another saint would confirm the exact same warning with even stronger words. Padre Pio, known for his profound faith and intense spiritual experiences, said something that frightened those who heard him. Heaven descends to the altar during Mass, and he said that because he saw it. Padre Pio claimed that while many saw only a priest celebrating Mass and people sitting in the pews, he saw angels around the altar. He followed each moment of the Eucharist with profound respect. For him, Mass was never something simple or repetitive. Each celebration was unique. Each one was serious. Each one demanded inner silence. But there was something that deeply saddened him. Padre Pio said that he also saw people receiving communion without understanding what they were receiving. Distracted people, unprepared, without awareness. He warned that this was spiritually damaging, not because God rejects anyone, but because many approach the greatest mystery without perceiving its grandeur. When Padre Pio spoke about this, he repeated a phrase that resonates to this day. If people knew what happens at Mass, the churches would always be full, and no one would be left standing. This phrase directly links his experience to the vision of Saint Teresa. Both saw the same hidden reality. This helps us understand something important. The problem has never been a lack of miracles. The problem is a lack of attention. The miracle is there, happening even when no one notices. Saint Teresa saw this. Padre Pio confirmed it. And this message has traveled through time to reach us. For Padre Pio, Mass was never just a beautiful prayer or a moment of peace. For him, it was Calvary itself, happening again. People who knew him said that during the celebration, his face would change, his body would suffer, and he would often cry. It wasn't exaggerated emotion. It was because he via what was happening spiritually. Padre Pio said that at the moment of the Eucharist, the sacrifice of Jesus became truly present, not as a remembrance, not as religious theater. For him, Christ was there, offering himself again out of love for humanity. This explained why Mass took so long when he celebrated it. Every gesture was made with extreme care. Every word was spoken with weight and truth. He also stated that he saw Christ's suffering directly linked to people's behavior. When there was faith, silence, and respect, the atmosphere became lighter. But when there was distraction, haste, or indifference, Padre Pio felt it as pain. He said that Jesus' heart suffers when love is treated as something commonplace. This is an important point for understanding his mission. Padre Pio didn't want to frighten anyone. He wanted to wake people up to show that Mass is not just any custom, but the most serious and loving moment that exists. To help a child understand, imagine someone who loves you so much that they give themselves completely to you, and you don't even notice. Padre Pio saw this happen every day, and that's why he suffered, because he knew that right there, in front of everyone, was the greatest gift in the world, often ignored. This is where things get more serious, because the vision of Saint Teresa and the warnings of Padre Pio lead us to a question that, annoying, what if the problem isn't with God, but with how we approach him? That's where many people's faith begins to waver. Saint Teresa understood that it's not enough to be at Mass. It's not enough to receive communion. It's not enough to repeat beautiful words. If the heart is distant, something breaks inside. Padre Pio said that many people had faith, but a faith asleep, automatic, without awareness of what was really happening. This is frightening because it forces us to look at ourselves. How many times have we gone to Mass without paying attention? How many times have we thought about other things while something so big was happening at the altar? This question doesn't accuse, it awakens. And awakening isn't always comfortable. For Padre Pio, this was the greatest spiritual danger, treating the sacred as something commonplace. He said that this doesn't happen out of malice, but out of habit. A person becomes so accustomed to it that they forget its value. Like someone who has a treasure at home and passes by it every day without noticing. This point can shake our faith because it touches on our responsibility. It doesn't change who God is. It changes who we are before Him. Saint Teresa felt this deeply. She understood that the Mass demands true presence, body, mind, and heart. And here is the strongest lesson. God continues to give Himself. The love remains the same. The question is whether we are truly prepared to see this, because when we understand what is at stake, it's no longer possible to participate in Mass in the same way. Saint Teresa and Padre Pio agreed on something that may seem daunting. The Eucharist is not something neutral. It is not merely a beautiful moment in the Mass, nor a symbolic gesture that passes without leaving a mark. For them, the Eucharist is like fire. Fire can warm, illuminate, and protect, but it can also burn those who approach it carelessly. Father Pio explained this simply. He said that whoever approaches the Eucharist with respect, faith, and an open heart leaves, strengthened, consoled, and transformed. But whoever approaches it carelessly, without attention, without awareness, does not leave the same. Not because God punishes, but because their heart was not prepared to receive something so great. Saint Teresa understood this at the altar. She realized that immense love doesn't change, but the way each person approaches it makes all the difference. It's like the sun. It illuminates everything, but those who close their eyes don't see the light. The sun doesn't change. It's the person who changes. Therefore, the Eucharist cannot be treated as routine. It is not just another Sunday. It is not just another Mass. It is a real encounter with something alive, something that demands inner silence, respect, and presence. This teaching is not meant to instill fear. It is meant to generate caution, to remind us that the greatest gift also demands responsibility. When Saint Teresa and Padre Pio spoke of the Eucharist as fire, they meant this. 1. Does not enter into something so powerful distracted. And when we understand this, everything changes. The way we sit, the way we look, the way we pray. Because in the presence of fire, no one remains indifferent. Perhaps you're wondering why such powerful stories as those of Saint Teresa and Padre Pio, they are not spoken all the time. The answer is simpler than it seems. These visions were never given to cause fear, confusion, or spectacle. They were given assailant alerts intended to touch the hearts of anyone willing to listen. The Church itself has always treated these experiences with great care. Nothing was exaggerated. Everything was studied, monitored, and analyzed calmly. This is because faith does not grow through shock, but through understanding. Saint Teresa never recounted her visions to show off. Padre Pio never liked attention. On the contrary, both tried to hide these experiences for a long time. These stories have become more private because they require spiritual maturity. They are not for empty curiosity. They are for conversion, for inner change. When someone listens to these accounts with a closed heart, they may misunderstand everything. But when they listen with humility, something awakens within. Another important point is that the world has become increasingly noisy and distracting. Amidst so much fast-paced information, profound messages end up being overlooked. Not because they aren't important, but because they require silence, reflection, and time. That's why these visions reach us almost like a whisper. They don't shout, they don't force, they only warn. Saint Teresa and Padre Pio left signs, not impositions. And the most beautiful thing is this: whoever wants to listen will listen. Whoever wants to reflect will reflect. These accounts were not intended to frighten anyone. They were intended to remind us of something essential. What happens at Mass is greater than we can imagine. The big question now is, how are we participating in Mass? Saint Teresa and Padre Pio realized that people's greatest mistake was not in doubting their faith, but in to treat Mass as something commonplace. They realized that many of us go to church, take communion and pray, but we do all this without truly understanding what is happening. And that, according to them, is the greatest danger. Imagine you have an incredible gift, a treasure, but you can't see its value because you're distracted. You simply take it without giving it importance, without understanding how much it can transform your life. This happens when we participate in Mass without awareness. We are facing a mystery that could change everything, but often we pass by it without even realizing it. Father Pio used to say, if people saw what really happens at Mass, they would fall to their knees. He didn't say this to scare people, but to awaken us to reality. Mass is not just a tradition or a ritual. It is the very moment when Christ offers himself for us once again as on Calvary. And this offering does not depend on our emotion or understanding. It is there in a real way, independent of what we feel. Saint Teresa also perceived this. When she looked at the altar, she saw not only bread and wine, she saw the living Christ, offering himself out of love. But what touched her most was the indifference of the people around her. Many were there, but without realizing the magnitude of the moment. They were physically present, but their hearts were far away. And this made Saint Teresa understand something important. True participation in Mass is not merely physical. It requires the presence of soul and heart. Therefore, the invitation is clear. Instead of merely fulfilling the obligation of going to Mass, how about taking this opportunity to truly be present, to feel, understand, and above all, surrender to the moment? When we do this, the Eucharist can change our lives forever. After all that Saint Teresa experienced and all that Padre Pio taught, it is clear that these stories are not accusations or threats. They are invitations, silent, simple, and profound invitations. Neither of them wanted to instill fear in people. Their only desire was awaken hearts. Saint Teresa, after the vision, did not go around pointing out the faults of others. She changed herself. She began to experience Mass with more inner silence, more attention, and more love. Each gesture, each prayer, each moment before the altar took on a different weight. For her, being at Mass was being in the presence of something alive, real, and too precious to be treated hastily. Father Pio did the same throughout his life. He never celebrated Mass as if it were just another one. He was never in a hurry. It was never automatic. He often cried, remained silent, and took his time. It wasn't exaggeration, it was awareness. He knew that something was happening there that the whole world needed, even without realizing it. The invitation left by these two saints is very simple, and any child can understand it. Pay attention. Look with your heart. Be truly present. You don't need to understand everything nor feel anything extraordinary. Just be present with respect and sincerity. They teach us that God doesn't demand perfection, but asks for truth. He asks for an open heart, a heart that recognizes that this moment is special, that it's unlike any other moment of the week. Saint Teresa and Padre Pio show that Mass doesn't need to be long or complicated to be profound. It only needs to be lived consciously, and when that happens, something changes inside. Maybe not immediately, maybe in silence, but it changes. And now the question that just won't go away remains, a simple but powerful question. What if you could see what Saint Teresa saw? What if, for just a few seconds, your eyes could see what really happens at the altar during Mass? Would you remain seated in the same way? Would your heart be at peace? Saint Teresa saw it and was deeply moved. Padre Pio saw it and wept throughout his life, not because God was distant or cruel, but precisely because the love was too great. A love so strong that it continues to give itself even when almost no one notices, even when there is distraction, even when there is routine. This final question is not meant to instill fear, it is meant to generate reflection. Because if all of this is true, and these saints testified that it is, then Mass is not just a weekly commitment, it is a real encounter. An encounter that can silently transform those who choose to be truly present. Perhaps you will never see with your own eyes what they saw. Most of us will never see it, but we all can. change the way of being there, we can approach with greater awareness. We can quiet our hearts. We can look at the altar with more respect. Small gestures make a big difference when we understand the value of the moment. Saint Teresa didn't ask everyone to have visions. Padre Pio didn't ask everyone to cry. They asked for something much simpler: awareness, presence, truth. And now the question rests with you, echoing in the silence of your heart. If you could see what they saw, would you still attend Mass the same way? If this reflection resonated with you, write in the comments what touched your heart the most. I really want to know your opinion. And if you feel that this type of content helps you see faith in a deeper way, subscribe to the channel here. Each video is an invitation to look beyond the obvious, with simplicity, respect, and truth.
Hear the true prophetic message.